So good day and welcome to today's Association for Learning Environments webinar, Creating Safer, Resilient Schools. Our speaker today is Laura Sockleben. Laura has been dedicated to educational facility design for more than 15 years. Active in the sustainability movement for educational facilities, Laura is the current chairperson for the Texas Society of Architects School Safety Work Group. She leads the Stantec Research and Benchmarking Program, which inspires and supports learning by constantly researching best practices and applying this knowledge to our design process. In 2014, Laura was named the Young Architect of the Year by the Houston AIA, and in 2017, she was named to Engineering News Record's National Top 20 Under 40. So I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar, and I'm now going to turn the presentation over to our speaker.
Thank you very much. Well, you heard a little bit about me. I wanted to just say a little bit about Stantec. It's a global and architectural and engineering firm, and we have practitioners in all sorts of areas, including healthcare, aviation, transportation, water, and of course education, which is what I do. But one of the awesome things about being a part of this type of practice is the overlap of our practice areas and what we can learn from each other. So areas like aviation have helped make my work better in safety and security, and of course, you know, there's a lot we're learning right now from our healthcare counterparts with what we're dealing with the pandemic. The presentation today on creating safer, resilient schools, it's really diving into the imperative of safe schools, that wherever we are, whatever type of project we're involved with, part of that conversation is always about what more can be done through design to protect our children and their teachers at school. It really is a universal concern. We also understand that the range of concerns and perspectives that influence the actions taken to address school safety are complex, which is to say that in our experience, it's safe to say that safe schools mean different things to different people. In addition, we can't talk about safe schools without addressing resilient schools. In this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about why. This is an AIA, continuing education course, and the learning objectives for today will be learning why safe and resiliency is important to our schools, what our schools must be resilient against, both threats and disturbances, history of school safety issues and findings of school safety and what the data really tells us, and building design strategies for school safety and resiliency. So before we dive into the presentation, I think it's important to take a moment to understand the difference between recovery and resilience. Recovery by definition is reactive. It is returning to a normal state of health or strength or well-being after something has happened, and it's the act of regaining something that has been taken away from you, so it is a reaction. Resilience, on the other hand, is proactive. It's setting up measures ahead of time in anticipation of a stress or disturbance. And so reality at its core, resilience is the capacity to adapt to changing conditions. And so it's not just going back to where you were when something happens. It's bounding forward to make sure that you're more prepared for the next event. So why is resilience and safety important in schools? Well, the reality is that schools are often the center of the communities that we live in. They're the places that our kids spend most of their day. A lot of times they're landmarks and places of gathering within a community. And what we find is when disaster strikes, it's the school that people run to. They act as shelters during natural disasters. It's a place where people find resources to recover after a tragic event. So the challenge with that is that we want to keep our schools secure, but we also have to realize that they are public buildings. And so it may seem that those things are in conflict with each other, and in many ways they are, but there are ways to navigate it so that those things can work together. So the challenge really lies in the fact that this is not a military outpost that we're talking about. You know, Fort Knox is the place where most of the gold for the U.S. is stored. There's precious metal that sits behind a 22-ton door. The vault has a combination lock on it that takes 10 different employees to open, and each of those employees have only their portion of the code. Schools are not like that, right? We've got hundreds, thousands of kids going in and out of the doors of schools every day, and there's more than one access point to those. So we can't approach a school in the same way that we would Fort Knox. The other thing is that the primary focus of schools, the reason we have schools, is because we're teaching our children for the future. We're inspiring them for their future and what they want to be. And so the big question is, can our schools be both inspiring and safe at the same time? To answer that question, we really have to understand, what are we trying to be resilient against in our schools? What are the types of things that we have to prepare for? Natural disasters is a big one, whether it's flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes. These are things that our schools face. And if you look at the numbers of natural disasters, it's billions of dollars that it's costing our country just in the U.S. And of course, these issues happen around the world. Billions of dollars that go into recovering from these types of events. You know, I live in Houston, and Hurricane Harvey was something unprecedented that impacted us personally, but also our schools. But it's not just hurricanes. This is a map showing climate disasters that are over $1 billion around the U.S. And this is just in 2017. And what it tells us is, no matter where we live in the U.S., we're all at risk at some form of natural disaster. And the level and depth of that just depends on the time and where we are. The fertilizer explosion that happened in West Texas reminds us that there's other hazards in our community that we may not see or think about that we have to be resilient against as well. And of course, today, we're all living with different forms of shelter in place and things related to COVID-19. And what we've seen is that schools almost overnight have had to change the way that they deliver instruction so that they can keep this very important function in our society going. And for the most part, they've done a phenomenal job. The other thing that has been exposed, I think, through what we're dealing with the pandemic is food insecurity and how much of a threat that is to so many of the children in our country. And what we're seeing also is that schools and school districts continue to feed the kids and in some cases their families throughout this event. So even though the schools are closed, they're still setting up food distribution centers and making sure that kids are fed on a daily basis. And of course, one of the things that we see prior to the pandemic that we see a lot in the media and around us is the discussion of violence in schools, whether that's active shooters or even bullying and cyberbullying. And so a lot of times we ask ourselves, are these conversations new? And the answer is no. Whether we're talking about natural disasters, school safety, or even pandemic, although the specifics and the details are different, the concepts and the types of threats are not new. 9 decades before the current situation we're sitting in with COVID-19, you know, the second wave of the 1918-19 influenza pandemic struck the United States. In response, most of the urban communities closed K-12 public schools for an extended period of time, in some locations for as long as 15 weeks. Typically, the order to close schools came later in the epidemic curves, and that's something that we're doing differently now. But it came alongside things like quarantine, isolation, bans on public gatherings, and all those types of things. And of course, with school safety, this isn't something new either. If we think back over time and what we've seen in the headlines, school shootings are a thing that we see a lot around us. And because it's such an emotional topic and because the news surrounding us is so accessible these days, a lot of times it can surround us 24/7, and it can feel like we've never experienced this before. But I think part of it is that we're experiencing it differently. And of course, you know, as we talked about, threats and stresses they change over time. The details and the magnitude of them change, and so they do feel different. Looking back, 2018 was a year where we saw a lot of injuries and deaths related to school shootings. And the reason I show this slide is because what we have learned over time is that this can happen anywhere. If you look at the map, it's spread around the U.S. And this is only capturing data from the U.S. But then let's take 2019, and you'll see a similar thing, that these can happen anywhere. So there's no playbook for where these things occur and when they can happen. And because these are such emotional, invoking events, a lot of times we see a very real and emotional response, and those can come in the form of knee-jerk reactions. Many of those knee-jerk reactions are related to the built environment, but other reactions can include policy changes, operational procedure, and the purchase of new products. Immediately following a school shooting we saw a few years ago, we saw local leadership come out immediately calling for the removal of all doors from the schools except for the front door. That type of statement comes when someone is reacting to one very specific threat, a school intruder, but is forgetting about the other threats such as building fires, which require many exits to safely get occupants out of the building. Other reactions we've seen after events include implementation of programs that allow school staff to carry weapons on campus. People feel pressure to fix the problems and fix them quickly, and they often pick one thing that they think they can address quickly. And, a lot of things, we hear about metal detectors a lot, and in some schools that is something that helps them, that they think is great, but I think the reason I show this is to say that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. And the thing we have to remember about metal detectors is they're fixed. A lot of these incidences are coming from within the school, from people who are supposed to be there anyway. And so if people know where those things are, they can find ways to bypass them. So really it's just to reinforce there's not one solution that fits all, and there's not one product alone that can solve this problem. So I want to take a minute to just look at some of the data to help us understand the issue as a whole. In 2018, again, that was, the map I showed just a few slides ago, where there were a lot of incidences that year. We saw a spike, and 34% of parents feared their child's safety in school. But if you start to look over time, you look back to 2013, there was actually, that was a low year where only 12% of parents had that kind of fear. You go back to 1998, it was even higher than it was in 2018 at 36%. And you go back to 1977 and it was lower. And so what this shows us is that, the sentiment changes over time depending on what we've experienced in our own personal experiences. And so what we're feeling today may not be the sentiment that comes a couple of years from now. The other thing that I think is important, in that same year where fear was high from parents, 76% of parents supported mental health screening of students. And, I think what's really important to me about that statistic is that its parents are acknowledging that we can't just fix the problem only by talking about security, that we must talk about the well-being of our kids in this conversation as well. And then I also thought it was interesting, in 2019, 84% of parents named something other than safety and security as the biggest problem in our schools. And really, if you start to look at this over time, over the last couple of decades, the number one issue in the perception of the number one issue in schools has really been around lack of financial support. And so, I say that just to say it's a very complex issue, and there's a lot of things that have to be solved at once. I also think we need to look from the perspective of students. The data tells us that to students, getting to do what they do best, especially at the high school level, drives their perception of success. I think it's a little bit discouraging to see that only 49% of our students are engaged, but I think it's very telling that the percentage of those that are hopeful aligns very closely with those that are engaged, so that if we keep our kids engaged, that makes them hopeful. And so, some of the things that stand out are also that the older they get in their school career, the less they may feel that they have adults that care about them. And so it's important to focus on the kids, their engagement, the types of activities that they're engaged in, and the types of interactions they have with the adults. Also interesting is when you ask teachers, they would prioritize stricter gun control laws to reduce the problem over just physical changes to the building. So 57% wanted to look at policy outside of the school versus 33% that said let's put more security checkpoints in the building. To me, I think teachers realize that once the school day gets going, students are coming and going throughout the campus inside and out. Any issues that we have in the community walk in and out of the doors of our schools every single day with our students. So we can't put all of the responsibility on the school building alone to try to keep the problems out. Another thing that I don't think is that surprising is that 73% of teachers oppose being armed. I think most teachers get into teaching because they care about students and they care about learning. And so they might have chosen a different profession. It doesn't mean that there aren't teachers that are very well equipped with weapons, but that's not the primary focus of the profession. So that's something to keep in mind as well. And then I also think it's important, Columbine is an event. It's one of the first that I remember. And, many have spent a lot of time analyzing that event and comparing it to events that have happened since then. And I think, there's still a consensus, from the FBI and others that there's no profile of a school shooter. In fact, one of the only things that is consistent is that most of them have told someone ahead of an event about what they were going to do. And so I think what that speaks to is the importance of making sure that we set up an environment in our schools where both students and staff feel empowered, that when they see something, they say something, and in the hopes that some of these things might get warded off ahead of time. So I think we need to think about what kind of environment we're creating. All this data before has told us that it's not just the physical building that's going to solve this. There's a lot of other issues. But what are some things that we can do through building design to help all those other issues? So we need to think about, how do we make our buildings safer? A lot of times when we think of safe facilities, people think of airports and the checkpoints you go through there, military checkpoints. But again, schools are very different from this. And do we really want our children who are supposed to be there to learn to be in an environment that feels like one of these other types of institutions? And so I equate this to kind of thinking about the difference between a porcupine and a koala. And so I'll ask you for a moment, I usually do this with people in the room sitting with me, but I'll ask you for a moment, if I said to you, okay, I know most of you are working from home right now, I'm going to get a companion for you to help make you feel comfortable in your environment right now. Maybe your kids are doing homeschooling right now. Which of these animals would you choose? And I will tell you that when I ask this question in person, usually almost everyone in the room says the koala. It seems like in every room there's one that says a porcupine, and I haven't dug into the psychology behind that yet. But all in all, most people pick the koala because it makes them feel comfortable. It's warm and cuddly. But the point to this is that both of these animals have defense mechanisms, but each invokes a different kind of reaction from you, right? When a porcupine feels threatened, they curl up in a ball and their quills are there, and their quills are supposed to ward you off. A koala, though, don't let a koala fool you. Koalas can be very ferocious In fact, there was a story, I think it was probably 15 years ago that came across a story of 4 gentlemen who broke into a zoo to try to steal a koala. And that koala was so ferocious and tore them up so badly that they abandoned that plan and went and stole a crocodile instead. And so, you know, the reality is, even though the koala gives off this feeling of comfort, don't be fooled by the koala. The koala can hold its own. So I think we need to bring that kind of thought process into designing schools and designing those environments. When working to strengthen our resilience or our safety, we have to remember that the physical environment has a direct impact on the occupants within the building and the educational environment that our kids are learning in. So what are some examples of safe and comfortable design? You know, one of the things we look at in school safety is preventing vehicular intrusion. And so we've all seen Ballards before, and they give off a certain sense of do not pass here, right? And so you could equate this to the Porcupine. But this is an example of an elementary school where we've changed the Ballards to make them more fun. We've brought color in. Functionally, it's doing the same thing, but the feeling that it gives you is more like the koala, let's say, than the Porcupine. Other ways that we've done this is through concrete benches. Again, it's got a function. If kids are waiting to be picked up, they can, you know, be congregating on the benches. However, those benches are also there for another purpose. Maintaining visibility and connection is another really important piece of safety, both being able to see what's happening inside the building from outside and being inside and knowing what's happening outside. So transparency is very important. Many of you may have gone to a school like this. I know this is what the hallways of my school look like. If something was happening behind any of these doors, nobody except for those that were inside that room would know what was going on. Conversely, you know, we start to design environments like this where there's lots of visibility and connection, where you can see and be seen. It also helps create a sense of community within a building, and we know that that's very important in resilience. And as a school, you know, district or a planner, you have to take into consideration all the aspects of security. The site and the perimeter is often referenced from the building perspective. However, the boundaries really extend all the way to a student's house. What is the path to school like? Can students walk and bike safely to school? Are there major intersections for them to navigate? Are there areas that are not populated or barren that could cause mischief? You know, we talk about access to support buildings also that are not connected to the main building. So really we have to look much further than just the building itself. And we also have to remember that a lot of what drives design is code, and those codes are there, again, to protect against fire safety and other types of safety issues, indoor air quality and all of those things. So any of the measures that we're putting in for safety can't negate the safety measures, the life safety measures that are put in for code. Also, you know, there's a lot of things aren't code driven, they're best practice driven. You know, these are dictated to the architect based on user occupancy and building size. For, you know, for school buildings, we see a lot of what we call passive and active systems. So a school vestibule is a great example of where you've got these active systems, controlled entries, blocking systems, there's camera systems, but there's also passive systems, you know, with direct line of sight, transparency, locations of things like the main office, or if you've got resource officers on campus where those are located. So these things are not code driven today, but there is a lot of best practice. And then there's more, you know, we've got codes now that talk about shelters, and I think there's an opportunity, you know, these codes are really looking more at natural disasters, but I think there's an opportunity with school safety to get dual use out of things that are driven by code for shelters, and how might those be used in other kinds of threats that a school is trying to deal with. So we want to make sure that we're taking a comprehensive approach to school safety. And one of the biggest things to acknowledge is that safety and security is dynamic. It's not static. I like to think of it more as a chess game where, you make a move and then your opponent is going to be making a move to try to get around you. And so you can go in and put in a safety measure, whether it's for physical safety or it's natural disasters, whatever that is. We have to remember that the next threat that's going to come, the next intruder or the next storm is going to look different, is going to act different, and so our work is not going to be done, and we have to always anticipate the next event. And we also have to realize that it's a team effort. When we're talking school safety, the answer is not, doesn't sit alone with local security, police force. They are absolutely an important part of the solution, but educators need to be at the table because remember we're talking about the educational environment, mental health experts, parents, students. It really needs a comprehensive approach to make sure that we're looking at all the priorities and all the potential issues. And so that's, that comprehensive approach is really what resilience is about. And so I'll talk about a couple of things related to resilience specifically. Resilient design is the intentional design of buildings, landscapes, communities, and regions in response to the threats and vulnerabilities that we face. And so there's a lot of resilient design principles. I think, the first is that resilience transcends scale. In other words, we're tempted a lot of times to look just at a building itself when we talk about resilience, but we need to think about the individual. Ultimately, resilience impacts every individual in our building differently. So how does it impact them? How to look at the scale of the building, and then we have to look at the scale of the community and beyond. We have to remember that resilient systems provide for basic human needs. That's something, we're seeing right now with pandemic is people are kind of having to change the way their interactions and what they do and make sure that we're still meeting basic human needs. Diverse and redundant systems are inherently more resilient, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the next slides. And the more we can do with simple and passive systems and flexible systems, the better. And what that means is if we've got these highly complex systems that only certain people can fix, or that parts aren't locally available and that system goes down, then we are now more vulnerable in whatever event is happening. Durability is very important, and that's always been important in school design specifically. And of course, those locally available resources as well. We've talked about anticipating future interruptions. Again, it's dynamic, it's not static. So anything we're doing, we're not expecting that there will be no issues and there will be no hardships. Resilience is anticipating those things and finding a way to promote resilience in nature. One thing I'll talk a little bit more later in the presentation is about social equity and community and how that contributes to resilience. And again, I keep kind of saying resilience is not absolute. So again, this should be an ongoing discussion in your communities. So that strategy of backup systems, belt and suspenders, we have to be ready and have strategies that if our primary systems fail, then what is our backup solution? We have to have plans in place so that people in the building know what those backup strategies are and how to enact them when the time comes. And, a lot of times another way of looking at it is circles of protection, making sure that we're looking at different layers of protection, both through the eyes of visibility, access, and control. And I'll kind of give you a quick run through of what that can look like. So let's take a school site here. If we're going to talk layers of security, the first place we're going to start is, again, that perimeter of the site. It does not start at the building, it starts beyond that. And really, I think, if possible, we want to start even further out than this. But this is definitely, with a campus, at a minimum, this is where you want to start thinking about where are vehicles accessing the site, parents versus buses, where pedestrians accessing the site, kids on bikes and things of that nature. And then the building is that next one. And when we look at the building, we want to make sure that we're looking at the inside of the building as well, right? What are those access points? So typically, we want to have one main building entry. This is a lot easier at an elementary campus. As we get higher up, we know that there's all sorts of functions in buildings, you know, gyms and auditoriums, all sorts of things that are happening at the middle and high school levels that make this more complex, but I'm using an elementary just for simplicity of concept here. If there's multiple entries, you know, you've got to look at each one of those separately. And then you've got to think about lockdown zones. How can you further break down the scale of your resilience within the building itself? And then, of course, how does storm protection fit into that as well? And knowing that through all this, you've got to have multiple ways of getting out. So there's the concept of locking in, and then the concept of how you're getting people out, and having lots of different options depending on what's happening. You know, there's a lot of, I think one of the most common things that we see now is the security vestibule. You know, those schools that don't have them, I think, are working on ways to get those in place, and that's one of the most common things I see in schools as a retrofit, is making sure that they're getting that secured vestibule at the front. We're seeing the strategies around vestibules changing. One thing that's really important is making sure that there's visibility from the front of the building looking out, and that's both from, in this example, you can see reception up at the front of the building, but the main administrative offices are facing out the front, so people inside the building can see what's happening. And also, I'm going to bring up a pointer here real quick, I think. Maybe not. You can see where the green arrows are. The police officer at this campus is positioned up near the front of the building where they can see kind of the big open areas. The yellow is the library there. They have direct connection through the waiting area, so there's kind of a backup system to those that are sitting at the front of the building as well. And then there's looking at the layers of protection within your security vestibule as well. And I see different things with each client, and you absolutely cannot have this conversation around security vestibules and security really anywhere on your campus without having a conversation about operation. You know, what staff do you have here, where are they positioned, and what are they capable of? The way that you design this absolutely has to align with your operational strategies. In this strategy, you know, there's an airlock, which is really brought about for energy code, but they have decided to use it as an initial layer for security, so that when someone first comes in, the only access they have is a window here, you know, which the receptionist sits behind. So they can't gain access to anyone through here. And then there's another checkpoint. They can go into a waiting room, and then they can get finally buzzed into the building. Again, this is going to look different depending on what your operational strategy looks like. And then, you know, there's strategies around zoning the schools, and you know, we talk a lot about open transparency, and a lot of times I get questions about, well, that's isn't that less safe? And so this is an example of finding a way to keep these open and transparent zones within the building. So this zone is broken down, or this school is broken down into pods, you could call them, that can be separately secured in the event that something happens, but on their day-to-day function are very open and inviting and promote that communal feel. Other strategies include, making sure that you have an emergency response plan. I think that's one of the most important things, and I see that more and more, where I think that maybe wasn't as common before. Now it's absolutely critical, and in fact, in a lot of places it's required. And I think the other thing that's important about these emergency response plans is they're not just created with local police, law enforcement, or school district security. Those plans are being created with members of the community, with the staff of the campus, and others outside of there. So again, it's that comprehensive approach. And in that plan, it should take into account all the other measures that you have on your campus, albeit surveillance, access control, the personnel that you have on campus, and so on and so forth. I've seen not a lot of these, but I've heard a lot, and I actually have seen some of these kind of door barricade systems. A word of caution with these is, I think you have to be very careful that through the use of these that you are not undermining fire egress and other code issues. I think we also have to kind of keep in mind that in the event, let's take an active shooter event, if someone was injured and went into a classroom and barricaded themselves and then somehow became unconscious, is there a way to be able to override these systems to get to somebody? So again, it's just thinking through all the different components of that. Some have taken personal defense strategies. I've not seen the blankets in person, but I found this and I thought it was interesting. I have seen the backpacks that some people have bought for their kids with the technology and materials. This is a lot more lightweight than it might have been a long time ago, and so it's something that some parents have decided to do as a personal strategy. And of course, one of the things I'm seeing more and more of right now are strategies around glazing and bullet-resistant systems. I'll emphasize on resistant, not bulletproof. It's not financially feasible to create bulletproof systems at this point. And I think really what we're after in these types of systems with the films is slowing down an intruder. And there's all sorts of, in all the different systems, you have to make sure you're looking at, what the levels of resistance are. You have to make sure that you're not just looking at the glazing and the film on the glazing, but also the frame and how that glazing interacts with the frame. Because you're really trying to slow someone down. I think I saw a statistic that said an intruder is not going to work for more than 14 seconds to try to get into any one location. So if you can slow them down, then the thought is that they will move on. I think it's always important to talk about door locks and building automation. I think low-hanging fruit and one of the easiest retrofits for schools to do is to look at their locking mechanisms. If you look at events such as the Sandy Hook event, they didn't have the ability to lock their classroom doors from inside. They had to go out into the hallway to do so. And so a very simple change there, would make a big difference. And so, you can go all the way to very fancy and lots of components to hardware, and I've seen some that are doing that, and that's great. There's hardware systems where you can remotely change access to every single door in a campus. But at a minimum, if you can't do those, just focusing on the locking functions of your hardware is a great first step, and it can be very effective. One of the things that we've seen a lot in the last probably 2 years, I would say, it has been the request to take the fire poles out of schools because we've seen shooters who have activated those poles and as a way to get people out in the hallway. And so there's been a lot of discussion between fire marshals and security personnel to find the right way to do that. And there is, as long as there is a pull in the administrative areas, what we have found, it's entirely okay to do that. Communication systems are very, very important. And we're seeing different types of alarms, so not just one type of alarm for fire, a different type of alarm for other threats, so that people in the building have a better sense of what's going on. Communication is very important. There's also technology that's emerging. This one is a system that is, I equate it to kind of a weapon detection system that takes kind of the metal detector technology and, makes it a whole lot smarter. And it's less visible, and it gets smarter over time to not only detect a weapon, but detect with some sort of certainty what type of weapon there might be. Again, these are things that are out there, being pilot tested, but not necessarily commonplace. I wanted to, before we wrap up, take a minute to just talk about resilient communities. You remember I said earlier that resilience transcends scales, and so we can't just talk about the building scale. We've got to talk about both the larger scale, which is the community, and the smaller scale, which is the individual. This slide, I think, had a different reaction before where we are now. It might make you cringe with all the hands touching. I apologize because we're in a pandemic, but really what this is about is community and how important social equity and community are to the level of a resilience that a community or an individual has. What data shows us is that those communities in which people are respected and cared for, that are the most diverse, they fare the best during times of stress and disturbance. And so it's an important reminder that the social aspects of resilience can be equally as important as the physical responses and anything that we may do to our environment around us. So there's a study that was done by the Youth Research Center at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education that I think is really interesting, and it looks at building resilience in children and young people. So that it's taking a look at the scale of the individual within our schools, and we look at all the risk factors that our kids may be facing, socioeconomic disadvantage, and we know the data tells us that a lot of times is a direct correlation to the success of kids in school. Cultural discrimination, isolation, neighborhood violence, population density, or lack of support services. And what's important is looking at what are the proactive factors that we can do to combat that. And you'll see a lot about a sense of connectedness, creating networks within community, participation in groups, a strong identity and access to support. Other bullying is on here, school failure, disengagement, parents not being engaged in school. And so, the things to do to combat that are, again, trying to create that positive school environment, making sure that we're engaging parents. And so that goes back to we can't make our schools a fortress where we don't allow the public in, right? We need some level of community connectedness to our schools for our social resiliency, and then making sure that we're getting our kids engaged. And so, a lot of times people think that resilience is, being strong as an individual, but really resilience, it depends on relationships and not independence. And so whether we're talking about school safety in terms of violence, or we're talking about natural disasters or hurricanes, what's really important is building partnerships ahead of any of these threats and stresses, and making sure that we're doing things to foster parent engagement. And really, I think this one is really important, and it goes back to some of the survey information we saw earlier, that making sure that there's at least one supportive relationship for students in a school. And that's in the effort to make sure that they're engaged and they feel empowered to talk to somebody about something. So, there's there's some information out there about a growth mindset, and I think this is really important in resilience, but also when you think about bullying, that what we believe about the potential for people to change has a direct impact on our behavior, our thoughts, our feelings, or our motivation. And so if you think of a student who's being bullied, a student who believes that people can change and that that's not the way it's always going to be is going to have a very different reaction to being bullied than someone who believes it won't change, this is the way it is. And I think some of the behaviors that you start to see as a result of those can be that. So I think it's important to make sure that we're reinforcing a mindset and really just giving hope to people. And so, part of building resilience is partnering with the school community, and that includes family and community services, leading activity across the school, bringing in a comprehensive approach, teaching social and emotional skills to all students across all year levels, supporting the young people who have been identified as needing additional assistance, and then when necessary, referring those in need to appropriate services. We know that our educational system, schools are not equipped to be able to provide everything, with the needs that all of our students have. And so it's having a system to be able to get them the help they need, even though it may not be from within the school. So just in closing, just a couple of resources, in addition to some of the ones that have been mentioned throughout the presentation. CPTED, which is crime prevention through environmental design. Some of what you saw in this presentation, those topics come from CPTED. And so they're looking at natural surveillance, access control, territorial reinforcement, maintenance, and connectivity. So that's a great resource when looking at safety and resilience. Of course, A4LE has the Safe Schools Best Practices Guide, which was updated a couple of years ago. So that's a great resource as well. And then Homeland Security is a great resource for many things, natural disasters, active shooters, and it goes into a lot about plans, emergency operation plans, and all those types of things. And so with that concludes the presentation. I think we can take questions.
Yeah, so if you have questions for Laura, go ahead and type those into the Q&A pod in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We've already had several things come in while the presentation was going, and Laura, I am not sure if you will know off the top of your head the slide that this was referring to. There's a question in here from Jillian. I believe it was one of the school design layouts that you had, and she was saying it was the first time she'd ever seen a toilet off a vestibule. What was the thinking there?
Yes, that's a great question, and let me see if I can get back to that slide maybe. So I will tell you, we're seeing more of that now. I am in Houston, Texas. I don't know if I've mentioned that. And so we are seeing more of those vestibules. And the initial thought behind it is probably this one right here. The initial thought behind it is there's a lot of people that come into a school on a daily basis, and they have to do things with the people up at the front of the school, so administrative things. But they don't necessarily need to be in the heart of the school where the kids are. So putting a restroom up there gives them the ability to keep the staff and students beyond the vestibule doors safe, but also provide a facility for those that may be visiting the campus and be there for a little while.
Okay. Our next question comes from David, and he asked if you could discuss the conflict between internal transparency and the need to be able to provide places of refuge that are removed from visibility.
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I will tell you that from personal experience, I was working with a school district a couple of years ago that is a direct neighbor to where there was a school shooting incident. And so we had a lot of conversations about this because we had been designing previous schools and had opened schools in their district that had a lot of transparency. And so, of course, those knee-jerk reactions that we talked about, which are very real, right? Emotional responses and this fear of, are we doing the right thing? What if something happens? Are there areas of refuge? So I've seen a lot of different approaches to this, and really, again, it depends on the specific school district, their campus, the personnel. One that I have seen is we have, on that classroom wall, given some percentage of transparency, more than, the old corridors where you didn't have anything, but you still have a number of windows where you can very clearly see in and out, but there is a portion of the wall that is solid. And so the thought is that if something were to happen, kids could go to the corner that is not visible from the corridor and take refuge there. Also, I will tell you, a lot of the buildings where we're putting in a lot of that glass, we also put curtains in so that very quickly in a lockdown situation, they can close those curtains, and whoever is in the corridor can't see, doesn't have a line of sight if those that are inside don't want them to have the line of sight. But I've also had some school districts who have taken the approach that to them, the building perimeter and those secured entry points are really where their security happens. And once they get inside the building, they're really more focused on the educational environment and the kids and making sure that they have an environment that feels safe and open and where everybody can see each other. So, like I said, there's no one size fits all, and I think, the definition of what the right solution is has everything to do with each individual campus.
Okay, our next question comes from Robert. He says, there still tends to be pushback on the use of glass. We talk about the importance of connectedness and to see and be seen. Do you know of any specific research that references to support the use of transparency as a means of security?
I don't know that I can quote any research that quotes it as a means of security. I think the definition, I think we'd have to define what security means, and I think even that is different to different people. There's the physical security, and then of course there's that the mindset of if we can be proactive and create a more calming and inclusive environment, that in that way we are being securing against events. So I think it's a hard topic, but I am not aware of any research specifically to that. But I will say there's a lot of emerging research that talks about the importance of having a welcoming environment that is more calming and less Fort Knox-ish, I will say.
Okay, our next question from Mark says, you mentioned an intruder will typically not spend more than 14 seconds trying to break into the building. Are you specifying laminated glass for first floor and vestibule glazing to provide forced entry resistance for a specified time?
So we are not, the 14 second statistic comes from kind of not from the film glazing manufacturers. So I have not seen where any of those films are saying we can give you this amount of time. It's just to reinforce that time, that you are not stopping a bullet from, going through a piece of glass, but you are trying to slow down an intruder to move on to the next thing. I will tell you where we see it the most. Number one place I see it is in security vestibules. So in these areas up in the front where we want to make sure we have transparency out so we can see what's happening, you know, making sure that we've got film there so that those that are inside can see who's approaching. One of the other details of the Sandy Hook incident was that the shooter was able to park up next to the building where no one could see him. And so we're trying to avoid that where people can see what's coming but still not have the ability for someone to just walk up and shoot out to gain entry. So security vestibule is where we see that first, and that's the main entry, but we also are seeing it at secondary entrances. There are instances where we're seeing it beyond that, so if there's a lot of glazing inside the building, but again, there is a cost implication with that, and so as with anything, any other decision making that happens in school projects or really any project, you have to work to set what the priorities are and build your strategies around that.
Okay, our next question is from Lawrence, and it says, have you given thought to how to utilize schools safely during pandemics such as COVID-19? How do we provide services for meal pickups and temporary medical areas of the school without leaving the school open to this type of threat?
Absolutely, and this pandemic situation has unfolded very quickly, but we definitely are having those conversations, both internally. Some of my colleagues who focus on healthcare have already been a part of transformation projects where they're turning some buildings into temporary hospitals. I have not seen where I am yet any schools being a part of that conversation. However, there have been discussions of schools becoming daycare centers for essential personnel who are on the front lines of the pandemic, so to speak. And so, but there is a conversation going on because I think what's apparent is when there's a pandemic, the schools are going to be empty. They're not going to have kids in there. So is there an opportunity to design schools or certain facilities within school districts, maybe not every school, that could act in that capacity should a pandemic occur? And of course, there's HVAC components to that, security components, and so there's a lot to think about there. And in terms of food distribution, I've seen a lot of different things happening there as well. Some of the distribution sites are happening at distributed campuses, but typically the distribution itself is happening outside of the building to minimize exposure. But there's also, I think in some cities, the school districts are setting up those distribution centers in other locations. And I saw where in Los Angeles, I think, they're feeding more than just the kids. They're actually feeding families in those neighborhoods as well. So great question. And I think there's a lot of discussion moving forward that we're going to have on that topic.
Okay, our next question asks if you know a good source for the collection of data on cases of sexual abuse in schools. Some say there are higher incidences of that occurring in school than active shooters, but many school systems desire to shut down visibility into spaces works to allow abuse to happen.
That is a great question. And I'm looking to see one of the things I had in there. I don't have it on here, but the Gallup poll that I looked at a lot or referenced a lot, it looks at kind of opinions around that. I do think there are some polls that are out there that track actual incidences in school, and I apologize, I don't have that off the top of my head, but I have looked at that data before, where it's not just looking at incidences in school related to violence, but it's also, I believe, sexual abuse is in there. Drug abuse is included as well, and also reported incidences that happen outside. So trying to get a handle on a student's safety outside the school versus inside.
Okay. Well, that's all of our questions that have come in today. Laura, any final thoughts before we go?
None to share. I just want to thank everybody for their time and the great questions, and I hope everybody stays safe and healthy.
Okay. Well, that's going to conclude our webinar. I want to thank Laura for sharing her expertise with us today and thank all of our registrants for attending the program. Your certificate of attendance and evaluation form will be emailed to you within 24 hours, and we ask that you take a few moments to provide us with your thoughts on today's program. We have a lot of great A4LE webinars on deck in the weeks ahead. You can see on screen here directly coming up on April 24th, occupancy evaluations, key to healthy and successful building, and also a Makerspaces program on May 1st. You can get registered for those as well as on-demand recordings of previous programs over at education.a4le.org. Thanks again for joining us and have a great weekend.